So we've talked basically about what it's like to be in a place where you don't really know how you got there, where you're supposed to be going, kind of lost. And we talked about the fact that that's not always punishment. We talked about the fact that sometimes we go through these places where God wants to prepare us for the next step. We go through these places of wilderness to prepare us for what's coming next. And there's so many examples in the Bible. I told you guys, if you go in your Bible and you find the number 40, you will always find a wilderness event, basically. You'll always find a time where God is preparing people for what's coming next. So we don't necessarily look at the wilderness as punishment. We look at it as preparation. But if you look at it as punishment, sometimes you stay there a lot longer than you should. And so we went through the story of the Israelites, the Exodus story, them coming out of slavery and coming into a land that God promised them. And they spent 40 years of preparation wandering around the desert before they got there. And we talked about Moses spending 40 years in the desert before he went and was able to lead them out. And then we landed and spent some time on Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. He went out into the wild for 40 days to be tempted by the devil. And we talked about how the wilderness is a vulnerable time. And that's why Satan attacked Jesus while he was out there and vulnerable, because he was hungry, he was alone, he was isolated. And sometimes alone and isolated is how you guys feel every day. If you're anything like I was when I was your age, there's a lot more wilderness than there is promised land. And I just want to encourage you that the promised land is there. And I'm speaking very figuratively. I hope you know that what I'm talking about is there are going to be times where you're not sure what you're supposed to do. There are going to be times where you're not sure if you're going in the right direction. There are going to be times where you feel lost. There are going to be times where God feels distant. But on the other side of that is His promises. And His promises are that He'll never leave you or forsake you. That He has a plan for you, a plan to prosper you, to build you up, not a plan to forsake you. There are all these promises. And on the other side of whatever trial you find yourself in, on the other side of testing, on the other side of temptation, is those promises. And you can lean on those promises in the times where you don't quite understand. Okay? So, basically I've hinted at the fact that there are basically two types of wilderness. And we're going to kind of hone in on that tonight. And we're going to try to figure out what the keys to survival in both of those are. And we're going to start out in the book of John. If you have a Bible, turn to John chapter 10. Just a little preface here. In the book of John, Jesus makes 7 statements where He says, I am. And then He says something else. You know, I am the way, the truth, the life. I am the bread from heaven. I am the vine. You know, he has all these statements. And they illuminate, like, who He is. They teach us through visual pictures His character. And the cool thing about John's gospel is John, in his writing, has these themes, and he keeps coming back to them. So it's like a spiral of different themes. And because of the spiral, and he keeps coming back, he keeps building on each theme in relation to all the other themes. So when we see that He is the way, the truth, and the life, and He is the Word of God, He is the vine, all these things work together to give you a broader and a clearer picture of who Jesus is. So the fact that He is the way affects the fact that He is the vine, and so forth. And tonight we're going to talk about where he is speaking to the Pharisees who were really challenging Him and bashing Him for something He did, which we'll get into later. And He stands up and says to them, I'm the good shepherd. And how many of you know what a shepherd is? How many of you have ever tried to shepherd sheep? Anybody? Okay, one person. Cool.
I've had to deal with freshmen before.
Okay, similar. Okay, if you're a freshman, you can beat them up later. Okay, I'm just kidding. Okay, so we're going to start in verse 1, and it says, "Very truly I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice." Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Therefore Jesus said again, "Very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father." Okay, so let's kind of debrief what's happening here. Can anybody tell me what they think is going on in what he says?
So he's comparing his life to a shepherd.
Okay, absolutely. And in doing so, what are some of the points he makes?
As people don't really find
Okay, his sheep recognize his voice. Okay, what else? Anybody other than common listening?
What? Yeah. From what I'm listening.
Yeah, it's a miracle, right? Okay. Okay. So what's going on here is he is saying that first of all, he makes the statement that he's a good shepherd, and that he calls his sheep. Okay, so because you haven't shepherded sheep, especially not in the ancient Near East, you may not know this, but a sheepfold was like a community pasture, basically. And because there were a lot more predators and a lot less fences, at night a shepherd would bring his sheep into the fold along with other people's sheep from that town, and there would be a gatekeeper who closed the gate and protected them till morning while the shepherd went to sleep and stuff like that. Okay, does that make sense? So it's like a holding pen for the sheep. And then when the shepherd got ready, he would go into the sheepfold. The gatekeeper would open it. He would walk in. And out of all the other sheep, when he called, his sheep would come to him. And I think that's a beautiful picture of what Jesus is doing. Jesus is calling people out of culture and out of religion and things like that. And those who truly know him hear his voice and follow him out. Okay, some interesting things I found out about sheep. I'm not going to harp on this long because I think a lot of people focus more on the sheep in this passage and how dumb they are, and not on the shepherd's love, which I think is the point. But a couple things about sheep. I found out, first of all, they are dumb. No matter how many sheep you have one brain cell. Because if one does something, the rest of them will. What I read and heard today was if they're in a pasture, they will eat all the grass. And then when there's no grass left, they won't leave. But they'll continue eating, and they'll actually eat each other's poop and actually die instead of going somewhere else. So if there's a pasture here and grass over here, they will die here in an empty field before they'll move, which is why they need a shepherd to take them from this place to this place. Okay, they desperately need the shepherd because, amazingly, they can't live on their own. Another interesting thing about sheep is they have no natural defense. You know, most things in nature have some form of protection or defense against other animals. You know, porcupine has the spines. Cats have claws and teeth. You know, dogs can bite and bark really loud to intimidate things. Porcupines have spines. Did I say that? My bad. Okay, yeah. And then you have predatory animals who have a lot more things. Sheep have no way to protect themselves.
They have fat.
Yeah, what will that do? Okay, the other thing, it is impossible for a sheep to clean itself. They cannot clean themselves. So they're dirty, they stink, things like that. So keep that in mind. The shepherd is life to the sheep. Okay? So in anything other than a perfect scenario for sheep, they really have trouble surviving without someone to herd them. So this person called the shepherd is extremely important. Okay, so this is one example, I think, of wilderness that we're gonna look at is the sheep pen. The sheep pen is like the holding pen. You know, it's a holding pattern. It's not their destiny. In fact, they can't live in the sheep pen. They will die. But it's a place where they can go for a little while to rest. Okay? And then they have to go out following the shepherd. The shepherd goes in and calls them and then leads them out to these pastures so they can eat and drink and things like that. Jesus tells another parable, and that's the parable of the lost sheep. And he's talking to the Pharisees in this too, and he says, if you have 100 sheep, if you have 99 sheep, maybe, I can't remember. If you have 99 and one of them runs away, won't you leave the 90? If you have 100 sheep and 99 and one runs away, okay, we're going to restart. If you have 100 sheep and 99 stay here and one of them runs away, won't you leave the 99 and go and get the one? And when you get the one, you will pick it up, put it on your shoulders, and carry it back. And you'll call your neighbors and tell them your lost sheep is found and celebrate. This is the story that Jesus says. An interesting thing here is if a sheep continued to run away, a shepherd would actually break its legs. And then the shepherd would carry it everywhere it had to go. And when the legs healed, the sheep would never leave the shepherd again. So if it continued to run away, the shepherd would actually hurt it in order to save it.
How many legs would it break off for?
The back two. Okay, so I just made that up. I don't really know. They will break the legs, though. I don't know which legs.
They probably break one front and one back.
Anyway, regardless, this is the picture, and this was how vital it was for the sheep to be with the shepherd. That if it continued to run away, the shepherd realized, I'm not there to protect it. The shepherd realized this is very vulnerable, and anything could happen to the sheep, so it's better. And think about the devotion. We just talked about how dumb and how smelly they were. And you would carry that wherever you went in order to protect it. And the ones that were closest, the ones that were carried the longest, were the most loyal. Yes?
What if it's like they heal? Would they just stay around forever?
They heal.
Well, but like,
They heal.
if they cast one, I don't understand how it would heal.
Heals everything but those over time.
I really don't know. I wasn't there.
Casting heals
Anyway, I'm sure they made a splint out of fig trees and vines. Okay. But here's the other situation. This sheep is lost. Okay, so there are a lot of people walking around in the world in a wilderness without God. They have not realized who God is, and therefore they have these spiritual senses that are not alive yet. Because we believe at the point where you believe in Jesus and you accept Him in faith, you are born again. There is a new birth in you. And at that point, you have a whole new set of spiritual senses. Just like our natural senses, you have spiritual senses that are open. And you begin to see things that you could not see when your spirit was basically dead. Okay, so this wilderness is a wilderness where you don't know God yet. This wilderness is the wilderness of being lost. The other wilderness is the wilderness of a holding pattern. Okay? You're being prepared, or you're letting the pasture rest so that the grass grows a little bit before you eat it all. It's a holding pattern. It's not permanent. It's a place you've already met the shepherd. You know his voice and things like that. But you're here waiting in order to go to the next stage. You guys follow that? Okay, so we talked about the sheepfold. And it's interesting to say, Jesus says those who don't come through the gate are not the shepherd, but they're thieves and robbers. So basically, because there's a gatekeeper, if anyone wants to get to the sheep and isn't their shepherd or doesn't have a right to go in, they have to find another way in. This is the temptation. This is the attacks. This is the world around you. This is culture. In this context, Jesus is talking about the religious leaders. And we'll get to that in a minute. The shepherd. What are some attributes we said about the shepherd? You said that the sheep know his voice. What else can you get from
A shepherd?
the shepherd? Shepherd. We're doing attributes of the shepherd now. Yes.
Like loyal or sheep.
Okay. Absolutely. Anybody else?
Strong.
Strong? Yeah.
Action.
Okay. Yes.
Protective and nice.
Okay. Protective. Okay. What about things in what I read? Do you remember anything that it said about the shepherd in what I read?
Putting down his own life to save the sheep.
There you go. Lays down his life for his sheep. Okay. We see, I'm just going to go through this list. The shepherd enters by the gate. The shepherd calls his sheep by name. It's personal, it's specific. The shepherd leads them out. And it says he leads them out and he lays down his life so the sheep may have life. Well, not talking about the sheep, but he says, I'm here so you can have life and have it to the fullest. He lays down his life for the sheep. And then a significant thing is the shepherd takes his life up again. And this is one of those defining places where you've got to decide, based on what Jesus says, if he is a liar and a lunatic or the Lord. Because, anybody in here can choose to die, right? If someone pulls out a gun, you can choose to dive in front of the bullet, right? You can choose to lay down your life. That's an easy one, right? Anybody can do that.
But you can't bring yourself back.
But none of you in here can decide after you die to come back to life. You can't make yourself undead after you're dead, right?
No.
So at this point, Jesus makes a statement where we have to decide. Is he a liar? Is he crazy? Or is he the Son of God? Because he right here, everyone who says, I don't believe in God or I don't believe in Jesus, but he's a good person. He was a good teacher. He may have been a prophet, whatever. This is where that argument breaks down because Jesus says things like this. And that means there's no middle ground because he can't be right and not the Son of God. So this is a cool passage because it calls us to a point where we have to make a decision about who Jesus is. And that's his purpose. He's calling his audience at that time to make this decision. And we have decided, I have decided that Jesus was who he said he was and still is because he took his life back up again. And here's the big thing. If the shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, what happens to the sheep after the shepherd leaves?
He dies.
The sheep aren't doing very good because the shepherd's not there to lead them, right? So it's incredibly significant to us because we're compared to these sheep that Jesus took his life back up again and still leads us, okay? So, how does this relate to wilderness? I think the significant thing is here. Whether you're one of the lost ones, whether you're the one that's left the 99, the shepherd is pursuing you. Whether you're in the wilderness of this holding pattern, whether you're in a place where you just kind of feel lost and you don't hear Jesus or feel Jesus like you used to, you don't know what's next, you don't know where to go. Everybody in your life is figuring out what they want to do with their life, or everybody's figuring out who they are, their identity, and you're like, I still really don't know. In that situation too, it says the shepherd comes into the pen and calls you. Okay, so what happens before this is really cool too, because this is directly connected to the narrative that's happening before it. And what's happening in chapter 9 is Jesus chooses to heal this man who has been blind from birth on the Sabbath, which was a huge no-no in that time. You didn't do anything on the Sabbath. You didn't spit on the ground on the Sabbath because that softened the dirt and that was considered plowing. You didn't drag a chair across the dirt because that would make rows and that is plowing too. They had these rules that were so ridiculous that kept you from doing anything on the Sabbath because God had said, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Okay, so Jesus comes in and he sees this man who's been blind from birth. And this is an interesting miracle because it happens in stages. But Jesus tells him, Jesus rubs some mud on his eyes. And he sees a little bit. And then Jesus does it again and he sees clearly. It's a two-stage miracle. It doesn't happen all at once. And I think that's significant because this is presented in contrast to the Pharisees. This guy goes from blind to sight. And the Pharisees, in their anger and jealousy and hatred towards Jesus, are going from sight to blindness. And we're presented with those two different sides. And basically, Jesus heals him, and he goes into the synagogue and gives an offering because he is healed. And people see him, and first of all, they don't really believe it's the same guy. And he's like, I'm him. I was blind. Now I can see. And they start asking him all these questions and grilling him and things like that. And he's like, Jesus did this. Jesus performed this miracle. I couldn't see, and now I can. Like I said, they don't like Jesus very much. So they're looking for a hole in his story. So, first of all, they say he's a liar. So they bring his parents in. And his parents are like, yeah, he was blind. This is him. And now he can see, and we don't know how. And they say, how do you think it happened? And they're like, ask him. You know, he's a grown man, ask him. Once again, they're kind of leveraging his parents to lie or to betray this man who healed him. And they're not willing to do it. And that once again, they ask him, and he's like, I don't necessarily know who Jesus is, but I know I was blind and now I see. And then they come to Jesus, and first of all, they cast him out. So this guy is thrown out of the synagogue. He can't be a Jew anymore. And they say, we follow Moses and you follow Jesus. We know that Moses was from God. We don't know where Jesus came from. And because you were testifying to him, you can't worship with us anymore. You can't come to church anymore. Things like that. So then they come to Jesus, and this is where our story begins. So Jesus' story that he tells is directly related to this blind man. So I want you to put yourself in the position of that blind man. Imagine that in this culture you have been devout from birth. You have followed the ways of your religion, Judaism. You've been faithful in things like that your whole life, but you've been blind. And then you meet this man, and through a series of him touching you, now you can see. But the moment you can see and something incredible has happened to you, the rest of the world turns on you. And you feel completely alone, and you have nowhere to go, and everything that you thought you've known for your whole life is now thrown up in the air because you're in this situation where you received something you really wanted, that you prayed for, I'm sure, that you hoped for and wished for your whole life and didn't think it was possible. But because you got the thing you've been dreaming for your whole life, now the rest of your life is falling apart. Or at least it feels like it. Some of you, that's where you are spiritually. You feel like the closer you get to Jesus, the more other things don't make sense. The more the rest of your life kind of slips away, or the more your friends don't understand you anymore, or the way your parents don't understand you anymore, or you feel like you're in a wilderness and you feel like it's because of your decision to follow God. Sometimes that happens. Jesus was led into the wilderness by the Spirit, by his Father, who, like we said, just says, "This is my son. I'm so proud of him. Good job, son." And then he goes and sends him to be tempted. It's not punishment. Sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes God has to separate us from our stuff, from our talents, from our friends, from our video games, from our computers, from our cell phones. Sometimes God has to separate us from that stuff so that we can look to him, so that we take the time to see him. Sometimes that wilderness is for our benefit, because without it, we'd stay focused on what's right in front of us. And instead of getting out of the wilderness like the Israelites, we'd waste our entire lives in this wilderness because we won't look up from a screen. And like the lost sheep, Jesus says, even if it hurts, I love you too much to leave you there. Even if it hurts, I love you too much to leave you lost in this place. Guys, I want you to know, if you're feeling lost, Jesus says, I'm the way. He says, come to me, all you who are weary, and I'll give you rest. If you're sick, it says he's the healer. If you're hungry, it says he's the bread of life. When you're scattered by fear, it says I'm the good shepherd. He says, you know my voice. He says, when you need anything, I'm the vine. Basically saying I'm your source for everything that you could possibly need. And in me and through me is the only way you'll have life and be able to produce fruit that's worth anything. He says, when you're hurting, I'm the comforter. Guys, what Scripture is telling us, what these I am statements are telling us, what he's telling us is that wherever you are, I am what you need. Guys, many of you have been in the wilderness for far too long. Whether it's the first wilderness we talked about in the sheepfold, going to church, relying on your parents' religion to save you, thinking about some past experience you had at a camp or a convention or at a revival or at a VBS or even at youth on a Wednesday night, living in the past, not developing your faith. Whether you're in that wilderness or whether you're the lost sheep that Jesus is seeking out in the wilderness that is separated from everything else. Jesus is pursuing you. And he's calling out, and for each one of you in here, wherever you are, in whatever wilderness, it's time to recognize his voice and respond to it. Jesus calls. He says, the sheep that are mine will hear my voice and will follow me. Sometimes we don't shut up long enough to hear the voice. And guys, tonight I want to provide time to do that. So in a minute, I'm going to ask you guys to bow your heads, and I'm just going to give you an opportunity to listen. And I want you to be honest with yourself about where you are. And I want you to listen to what Jesus, through the Holy Spirit, is going to say to you right now. Because he's calling all of us. Wilderness or not, he's calling all of us. But we need to make the decision first to take time to hear the voice, and secondly to respond and react. Jesus does not force you to follow him, but he calls. And he knows if you'll take that step, he can take you to green pastures. He can take you beside still waters. He can lead you where you need to go when you don't see even what your needs are. So I'm going to ask you to close your eyes, and I'm going to give you a few minutes of just silence, and then we're going to end in prayer. Guys, I appreciate your attention tonight. And as we end this series, I want you guys to know that in whatever situation, wherever you are, Jesus has an answer for it. And through those I am statements, he covers the gamut of anything we could possibly need. And he says, I am. More than that, this ties back to the Old Testament when Moses says, when they ask who I'm representing, when they ask who this God is, tell them I am. So not only is Jesus saying, I am everything you need, he's saying, I am God. We can't ignore that.